Hi, and welcome to an oral and conceptual framework for L2 academic language development. My name is Hannah Cowell, and I am an MA TESOL candidate at Emporia State University. Before we get started, I'd like to give you my introduction and abstract, so you can know what this presentation provides. You will learn about a critical and sociocultural framework for understanding how social language developments in an L2 can influence academic language developments in an L2. This topic is related to adult or adolescent English learners, specifically those who have limited L1 literacy or low academic competence in their L1. And finally, I hope that participants will gain insight into strategies to develop oral language in their students strategies that will also help develop academic language and conceptual thought. So we're going to look at how oral language can affect academic language and conceptual thought in the L2. So next, I'd like to give a blueprint for where we're going to go in this presentation so you know what to expect. I've given you my abstract and introduction. So first I'm going to talk about the achievement gap between ELs and their English-speaking peers, and also a gap in the literature regarding these students. I'll give you my research questions, and a bit about my background and my personal interest in this topic. Then we're going to distinguish between different types of language, so that would be the difference between social language and academic language. Then I want to talk about the relationship between L1 and L2, specifically in the area of CALP, which is Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. I'd also like to give you my personal conceptual framework for how to understand and to teach CALP, this academic language proficiency. I'm also going to talk about the role that oral language plays in academic development, specifically how oral language can affect development of academic vocabulary, structures, and what instructional and corrective techniques teachers can use. And then finally, I'm going to talk about pedagogical implications for language teachers. This would include linguistic, metacognitive, and oral language development strategies for the classroom. And then finally, I'll give you my references, recommendations for future research, and a conclusion, and of course my contact information. So, a gap in the literature on the achievement gap. It's pretty well documented that there's an achievement gap between English learners and monolingual English-speaking peers in academic areas. This is particularly noticeable in reading and writing. ELs often seem to be proficient in English, yet there's a gap in reading and math and other academic areas. And this gap generally tends to get worse over time, not better. So there may be a small gap in elementary school, but it will get wider by the time the students reach high school. And this is an issue because academic proficiency represents access to higher education, to gainful employment, and to all sorts of opportunities in a literate society that values academics. But what we need to think about is that students who have low literacy in their L1, in their first language, may come from a culture where print literacy is not part of their socialization process. It may be that they come from a culture where oral literacy is more valued. So we need to think about how we can teach these students academic proficiency when our definition of it might be a little bit different than theirs. And traditionally, there has been a bias toward developing academic proficiency through reading and writing, not through speaking and listening. This researcher did some work and noticed that reading and writing in particular is often used as the academic domain, and speaking and listening is often used as the social domain. And then finally, studies have usually focused on academic language transfer among students who were literate or who had some formal schooling in their L1. So either L1 literacy or formal schooling in the L1. Normally students who have low L1 literacy have not been studied, and that's a gap in the literature that I would like to address in this presentation. So to frame my research questions for you, I'm going to look at my research questions through a critical, conceptual, and culturally sensitive framework, which I'll present to you later. And the questions I want to answer are, what are the necessary components of English CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency, and how can learners with low L1 literacy acquire these components? Then I'd also like to explore how L2 oral language development, and especially L2 fluency, can promote the development of CALP in an L2. So just to give you a little bit about my background and why I care about this issue, I spent 2 years in East Africa teaching EFL. I was in a little country called Djibouti. It's that little tiny red dot right there next to Somalia. And I was teaching EFL at a university which generally had low resources, and a lot of these questions really stuck in my mind because my students were from a mostly oral society. Almost none of them were literate in their L1, which was either Somali or Afar, but most of them were literate in French, which was the educational language there. So I noticed that my students were comfortable learning orally, but they often, they just didn't have the academic competence that they needed to succeed in jobs and in higher education. And so these questions arose as a result of my background teaching in a low resource area in EFL. So again, just explaining my personal background and interest. The culture I was in had storytelling and oral literacy as valued parts of the society, but there was really little value for or access to print literacy. The need for academic language was huge, particularly for jobs or for educational opportunities abroad, but those were limited because my students mostly had oral competence, not print literacy or academic competence in English. The use of communicative techniques was widespread in the EFL classes, and I really needed to know how I could teach academic language effectively so that my students could read and write proficiently in English. As I started researching, I noticed there was limited research on CALP related to these types of students. Most of the students that had been researched were literate in their L1. And particularly as I looked at academic language, there was often an emphasis on reading and writing, which for some of my learners was initially out of reach. But a lot of the literature emphasized reading and writing as the way to develop CALP. I saw this even in my textbooks for the MA TESOL. But these are all issues because CALP, defined in a broad way, is a social, economic, academic, and employment gateway. It has to be accessible to all learners. So now I want to move on to distinguishing different types of language and to getting into what is CALP a little bit more. So Jim Cummins was a researcher, and he was the first one to distinguish between BICS and CALP. So I'm going to explain to you what those mean. BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. It's often used in social and casual interactions. Generally, Cummins termed it as playground language, so what's necessary for social interaction. It's acquired in just 1 to 2 years normally. It's usually context embedded, so you can figure out what's happening just from the clues and the visuals around you. Cognitively, it's fairly undemanding, and this type of language is usually associated with listening and speaking. But in this presentation, I'd like to explore how BICS can be used to teach and to help students develop CALP. So CALP, on the other hand, CALP stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. It's often used in school and formal settings, and it's also an underlying proficiency that's needed for academic success. It takes much longer to acquire than BICS. Usually it's 5 to 7 years, and that's in an L2. That's not in your native language. Generally, the context is reduced. You don't have as many physical cues, and the assumption there is that you're using CALP with reading and writing, not with social language, so there aren't the physical cues that you would normally have. And then also it tends to be cognitively demanding. So, just to give you a visual, Cummins developed this framework for looking at BICS and CALP, and he put it in terms of 4 quadrants that on the horizontal axis has context, and on the vertical axis it has cognition, whether it's undemanding or demanding. So quadrant 1 is the easiest language. It's cognitively undemanding, and the context is embedded in the social interaction. Quadrant 2 might have more reduced context, but it's still cognitively undemanding. So this is the BICS area here. And then underlying that is the CALP area, where there is some CALP that has a context in it, that's embedded with context, but it's cognitively demanding. And then there's the hardest kind of language, which is context reduced and cognitively demanding. So that's what we would think of as academic language, quadrant 4. So looking at these quadrants more in depth, the first one in BICS is sort of here and now language. It's survival language, usually things that are high frequency words, simple grammar forms, and generally it's about 1,000 to 2,000 words, and it's used just to discuss what's going on around you. So that's context embedded, and it's cognitively undemanding. Moving over here to another area of BICS, we have what one researcher, Rosing, she terms it as my lived experience, which is context reduced, but still cognitively undemanding. So this might be where reading starts. It might include some emergent literacy skills like writing notes or recipes. The vocabulary is expanding a little bit. The grammar is still relatively simple, although there is more vocabulary here, potentially 2,000 to 5,000 words, although these aren't hard and fast. And then when we move down here to the CALP quadrant, there is there and then language, which is talking about things that are not in the immediate context. So here we start to transition to curriculum content, but there may still be a context. So that would be shown in visuals, realia, manipulatives. This could also show in thematic units. And generally in this, the learner has more words, but they still tend to be high frequency. They're acquiring some academic words, but their academic language acquisition is not complete yet. So then when we move over here to the hardest form of language, which is context reduced and cognitively demanding CALP, this deals with symbolic and metaphoric competence. So abstract thought, the educated imagination. Generally, again, lots of reading and writing is associated with this quadrant. So this is in grades, usually in high school or post-secondary ed, is where we find this language. And the number of words is disputed, but it could be generally 10,000 or more. is for someone who's highly educated in English. So as we move on, we're going to look at actually another acronym, CUP. A couple years after Cummins proposed BICS and CALP as a language distinction, he also introduced the idea of CUP. CUP is a common underlying proficiency between L1 and L2. So if you look at this diagram, on the surface here it would be the BICS language. This is the BICS or the social language of L1, and here is the BICS or the social language of L2. And Cummins' theory of common underlying proficiency, or CUP, theorized that underneath the social language there was an academic language proficiency that also included abstract thought. And he thought that this common underlying proficiency, if it was developed in an L1, could easily transfer to an L2, because it was not just a matter of content area vocab or grammatical structures, it was a matter of abstract, conceptual, and metaphorical thought. So he thought that if it was developed in L1, it could also be developed fairly easily in L2. And again, this underlying proficiency addresses the language, or the relationship between language and thought. So it's at a deeper level than just these surface structures. This is also called the interdependence hypothesis. I just want to note quickly that one area of concern is when a student, maybe a student who has low literacy in their L1, does not really develop this underlying proficiency. So I've seen some diagrams where this is a bit lopsided, and maybe they just develop the underlying proficiency in L2, which can really lead to a problem. It can lead to loss of language and identity in their L1, but the hope and the goal is that if this CUP is not present in the L1, if the student can develop academic proficiency in the L2, the teacher, their job is to help transfer that back to the L1 so that the student doesn't lose their L1 language and identity. Now, since we've talked about some metaphorical and abstract ideas, those can also be referred to as metacognition, and I just want to clarify what I mean by metacognition. So some tasks that would be associated with metacognition, which is part of the underlying proficiency that CALP represents, would be directing or focusing attention, setting goals, exploring multiple meanings, making inferences from a text or a speech, drawing conclusions, evaluating information, synthesizing, comparing or contrasting, and persuading. I also just want to emphasize what metacognition is. It's metaphorical and it's often symbolic. So this is the deepest level of CALP we're talking about now. Deals with abstract concepts, with complex relationships, and it relates thought to language. So students who have metacognitive strategies usually know how to look at their learning and decide or make decisions about their learning and evaluate it. So students can use learning strategies. They can apply prior knowledge that they have to a text or a speech. Often they can use linguistic transfer strategies. So that again goes back to that CUP we were discussing. Students can transfer proficiency that they've gained in their L1 to their L2. And then finally, metacognition includes pragmatic, strategic, and discourse competence. These competencies are part of an overall communicative competence. Pragmatic competence means knowing what to say and when to say it in a socially appropriate way. Strategic competence refers to negotiation of meaning That means that a student is able to negotiate meaning when they're lacking in a certain linguistic form or structure, so they can repair a communicative breakdown. And then discourse competence means being familiar with and knowing how to use the different genres and discourses that are specific to a language. So now I'd like to present my critical and sociocultural framework for understanding CALP. We want to ask ourselves, is CALP just specialized language plus complex syntactic structures? The reason I ask this is because a lot of research in the last 30 years has been done about CALP, and generally researchers tend to try to quantify this or operationalize it so they can study it. When Cummins originally developed this idea, it was largely descriptive, and he did not really quantify what CALP was. So because of that, there's been a trend towards operationalizing CALP and just viewing it only in terms of content area vocab and complex syntax. But I would like to argue CALP is a lot more than that. It is more than just the sum of its linguistic parts. CALP is both academic language and cognitive proficiency. Vygotsky also, his theories of education can help us here, because he looked at the relationship between language and verbal thought, and that language and verbal thought are used, learners use them to make a schema of their world and to think about what's happening around them. So this shows up in self-regulatory and metacognitive processes. It's also important to remember that discourse types and literacies can vary across cultures. As I explained before with my students in Djibouti, it was common to see students who were highly proficient in oral modes of communication, but really lacking in literate forms because that was not what their society emphasized as important. The development of CALP is also a dynamic and a socio-culturally and educationally mediated process. It is not just a thing to be acquired, it's a process of making sense of your world and forming a schema in your head. And this researcher notes, Ackerman, she argues that even cognitive abilities are socioculturally mediated. So for example, in English, technical vocabulary is seen as academic because it's part of our society, it's part of what we value as a technologically literate society. However, in a society that values, maybe water and camels, what counts as CALP would be very different. In that kind of society, it may be more important to develop memorization, oral history, and oral literacy strategies rather than literate or specialized technical vocabulary. This researcher also argues that all meaningful language has a context. So going back to that idea of BICS as contextualized language and CALP as decontextualized language, this researcher argues against it, saying if you're getting meaning from language, there's a context for it. She argues that to develop CALP is to expand the ability to identify, create, and expand new linguistic and paralinguistic contexts. So for example, familiar social forms that are learned in BICS could be recontextualized as academic metaphors. So CALP is learning to take what you've developed as your BICS and reshaping it to use it as metaphor and symbolic thought in academics. So overall, it's important to remember that CALP is not a thing, it's a culturally mediated process, and we need to be culturally sensitive to our students who may come from a culture that defines CALP very differently than how the U.S. defines it. So next, I'd like to move to discussing oral language and how it relates to CALP. So we've discussed CALP, and now I'd like to move on to oral language and discuss the dialogical possibilities. So, even though CALP is not merely linguistic structure, I've argued it's much more, we cannot discount the fact that vocabulary and syntax are crucial in academic development. Those are necessary areas, especially in English conceptions of CALP, and we need to help students develop those. This researcher, Saville Troik, she also notes that L2 oral fluency creates an automaticity of information processing. So if you're fluent in BICS, and you can automatically understand and retrieve the words and the syntax you need to know, this frees up mental resources for metacognition, or for those deeper thought processes that are part of CALP. Additionally, some learners are just simply more comfortable learning through the oral medium rather than through the print medium, as I've already described. So oral language and academic talk can provide scaffolding as CALP is developing, especially in the early stages of CALP. And some researchers have noticed that the output that's elicited from ELs, it tends to be often BICS rather than CALP in nature. So often when English learners speak in class, it's for more of a social reason than for an academic reason. But oral language can support vocabulary, academic structure, and syntax. Where teachers come in is using appropriate instructional and corrective techniques to help students frame their output in an academic way rather than in a social way. So now we're going to discuss 3 key parts where oral language can help English learners develop cognitive academic language proficiency. Those will be vocabulary, structure and form, so vocabulary, structures, and then in classroom methods. So let's go back and discuss vocabulary. It's well known that acquiring a word for recognition and for automatic retrieval requires multiple meaningful encounters. So students do not learn a vocabulary word just by reading it once or hearing it once. They need multiple encounters with the word. If the word is low frequency and a specialized academic word, it is unlikely that the learner will garner enough encounters with the word through reading alone. Additionally, to decipher a word from context clues, the reader needs to know 95% of the other words in a text. So if an EL is looking at a text, they're likely to have significant difficulties deciphering a word from context clues unless they know almost every other single word in the text. It's also been noted ELs have a significant vocabulary gap when compared with monolingual English-speaking peers. So if you're looking at BICS type speech, which we've described, that only requires about 2,000 words, while CALP-oriented speech, it can require at least 10,000 words. Some researchers say 20,000 or more. And finally, oral structured practice can provide the extra support that ELs need to close this vocabulary gap. So through structured practice and through encountering academic words, both in print and through oral language, that will strengthen an EL's grasp of academic vocabulary. Oral language structures. So one researcher, Guduru, he has noted that the most troubling language for ELs tends to be figurative and idiomatic language. So this includes idioms or expressions, phrasal verbs, such as pick up or drop off, and formulaic sequences. The reason why these structures are difficult is because they often represent underlying cognitive processes, complex relationships, and abstract concepts. These are multi-word syntagmatic chunks that are hard to decipher. Syntagmatic means that they have both meaning in terms of semantics and also meaning in terms of pragmatics or social use. So these types of chunks of language are very difficult for ELs to decipher. So there is a need, again, for explicit instruction and practice in a way that students feel comfortable, which is usually oral language that they've already developed in English. Especially cooperative learning techniques are helpful here because these promote self-analysis and reflection on meaning and metaphor. So if a group is trying to decipher the meaning of an idiom and they're coming up with potential meanings, then that will lead them into self-reflection and discussion if that meaning is correct or not and why. So these types of structures are also gateways to deeper levels of thought. And it's also interesting to note that students with low L1 literacy may rely more on semantic or meaning processing rather than morphosyntactic or grammatical awareness. So when faced with figurative language, a student with low L1 literacy is more likely to process the meaning than the grammatical forms that are embedded in that language. So then finally, we want to look at just some classroom methods, both instructional and corrective techniques that can be used to support the development of oral language. As I have said a few times now, explicit instruction is key. Cooperative learning is also a useful technique. Engage with students through oral language. Don't just have them read a text, but look at the text and then use the oral medium to mediate their understanding of that text. Along with that, you can negotiate meaning through interaction and recognize the unique abilities that these students bring to the classroom, such as a deep semantic processing, memorization skills, potentially, and also potentially strategic competence. These students may be highly skilled in negotiating meaning and repairing communicative breakdowns. So that's important to remember the gifts that these students bring. Corrective techniques. Because these students may not have well-developed metalinguistic awareness, meaning awareness of grammar and structure, they may need direct feedback. Similarly, if you are recasting, for example, if a student says, yesterday I goed to the store, and you say, yes, yesterday you went to the store, you may need to signal to the student that when you say, yes, you went to the store, you are actually correcting them. A student may not pick that up if they have low metalinguistic awareness. Focus on errors that do not impede meaning. So these would be errors like forgetting the S on a plural noun, or forgetting the inflectional S on third person singular. These errors do not impede meaning, so they're likely to go uncorrected. And if they go uncorrected, they may become permanent and fossilize. And then always keep repeating yourself and be patient. So I want to look at a summary of where we've been. This is my model of CALP. As you can see, it's a pyramid, and at the top, or the surface, we have specialized vocabulary and complex syntax. These would be more surface structures. A little deeper down, we have figurative language and metalinguistic messages or awareness. So that's awareness of how language is structured. And then at the deepest level of CALP, we have metacognition, abstract thought, and metaphorical relationships. So it's also important to remember that as a student masters the surface levels, that creates automaticity of processing. So as they become more fluent in some of these surface structures, that allows for automatic processing, and the student can move into some of these deeper forms of CALP. Finally, it's also important to remember in this model that each of these aspects of CALP is socioculturally and educationally mediated. We must keep that in mind as we're dealing with students. They each come with a diverse background that defines CALP differently. So now we're going to move into the final stage where we look at pedagogical implications. We're going to look at 3 types of implications for pedagogy: linguistic, metacognitive, and oral language strategies. So starting with linguistic CALP. Again, explicit instruction is needed of specialized content area vocabulary and complex syntactical structures. Students do not pick these things up on their own, especially if they have low metalinguistic awareness and low cognitive proficiency in their L1. They need the extra explicit information. You can use collocations by grouping words together. So an example of that would be restaurant, menu, waiter, maitre d'. Those words go together in a social context. You could also create semantic maps and group vocabulary meaningfully. Cummins also suggests you could create dual language projects or presentations, and these would allow for translation or clarification in the L1. This is necessary in the pre-production stage of second language acquisition, but clarification in the L1 is also necessary at higher levels of CALP, or I should say deeper levels of CALP, because students are encountering structures and conceptual thought, and they need to mediate that through their L1 to be able to understand it clearly. Teachers can model and structure output of formulaic language such as cohesive ties, logical connectors, and discourse markers. So these would be things like, for example, therefore, nevertheless, finally, next, things like that. Give explicit corrective feedback, especially regarding errors that do not impede meaning. And as I talked about with recasting, you could use a nonverbal cue such as tapping or knocking to signal when you're recasting and when it's corrective. So that way the student will know they're receiving correction from you, not just an alternate way of expressing their message. So that's important to get across to the student, that you are actually correcting them when you rephrase their speech. In terms of metacognitive strategies, you could teach how to substantiate thoughts from a text. I know in this presentation I focused on oral language, but that does not mean that reading and writing are not very key parts of developing CALP. It's just that you can mediate text through oral language. Within group work, you could assign roles of summarizing, questioning, predicting, analyzing, and connecting. And again, the group will help mediate and discuss and use negotiation of meaning to interact with a text. Show students how to paraphrase and guess from contextual clues. This also, as I mentioned before, can lead to self-reflection on if their meanings or their paraphrases are correct. So this again is a gateway to deeper thought. Teach strategies explicitly So strategies for language, general learning strategies, and strategies for language transference. You could give these names, teach them explicitly to the students, and then if they're having trouble, activate that strategy in their mind so they know what to do and they don't just feel like they're at a total loss. Thematic units are also really helpful in synthesizing information and thinking deeply, especially if it's a unit that activates your students' prior knowledge. You can encourage peer response and peer editing groups. This is, of course, after you as a teacher have modeled how to do this. It's best not to set students loose on group work without modeling and structured input first, because students need to know what you expect of them and what they need to do before they can be free to interact with their peers in a helpful and effective manner. And then finally, you can model questioning and peer response techniques to elicit more elaborate responses. So these might include genuine questions rather than display questions, meaning that you ask questions that you don't know the answer to, rather than just asking questions that will lead to one-word or facts-based answers. And then finally, pedagogical implications for oral language. This researcher, Seville Troik, recommends that you scaffold students' oral production. And you can do this through several means. You can repeat, paraphrase, you can expand on what they say or elaborate on it. You could give them sentences to complete or frames for substitution. Or you could also just periodically make sure that you check their comprehension, make sure that they're with you. Another interesting technique I read about was shadowing an EL, and that would be for a teacher to assess how much academic talk they're exposed to and also how much they're required to speak throughout the day. So this could help teachers assess where their students are at in terms of academic oral language. As I said before, model and demonstrate genuine questioning as opposed to display questioning, which elicits usually simple one-word or facts-based answers. Again, cooperative techniques are always very helpful, and that's because within a group, meaning is negotiated through strategic competence. So a technique such as think, pair, share might be useful. And then finally, use techniques that promote fluency and automatic processing. So if you promote oral fluency in the L2, as I mentioned before, it will free the mind up to process deeper levels of cognition, rather than using those resources just to process the basics of oral language conversation. So you can do this through rehearsal, through repetition, raise students' consciousness of certain forms as you practice them, and use formulaic sequences and discourse markers. So this is a list of my references. The main researcher, again, was Jim Cummins. He was the one who developed the idea of BICS and CALP, and also of CUP, the common underlying proficiency between languages, but many of these other researchers were helpful. I also wrote a paper on this topic, which includes more references, so you can contact me if you'd like any of those other references. And then finally, I'd like to end with future research possibilities and my conclusion. I would like to present that further research is needed, specifically in the area of L1, L2 CALP transfer regarding students who are illiterate in the L1 or have low literacy in the L1. This population is often understudied, but they need access to CALP just as much, if not more, than literate students. They also need access to higher education and job opportunities. So that would be an area for further research, is this specific population. And remember, if there's one thing you take away, it's the importance of explicit instruction in the area of CALP. Whether you're using the oral medium or a print medium, students will not just infer on their own. You need to teach them how to do things like that. So good teaching does not happen by accident, and students cannot run unless we teach them to crawl first. So I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. Please feel free to contact me. Here's my email and my phone number. If you'd like to send correspondence, you can send it here. And let me know if you have questions or if I can assist you as you are assisting your EL students. So thanks for listening.